I'd like to welcome you all to Dwinell West. I'm very happy, though, that we are making the best of a rather unfortunate situation. I was phoned by Dr. Strip several weeks ago, and he very graciously asked me to moderate this debate. And of course I accepted, and I had prepared a rather large opus for this evening. But in view of the changed circumstances, I'd just like to make a couple of brief comments. Number one, when Dr. Strip phoned me, I was very, very happy to accept and very, very pleased with his gracious invitation. On the other hand, I was, and I still am, a little deeply moved in that tonight we are not simply meeting for a fifth renewal of the Kennedy debate, but this evening we are, I think, broadening the memorial of the Kennedy debate by including the name of Robert Francis Kennedy in it. And it seems that due to another senseless act of perversion, we have to extend the breadth and the depth of a memorial debate to include the memory of Robert F. Kennedy. It seems very interesting that the Kennedys, the whole family, the mystique, the myth as well as the reality, is only about 8 to 10 years old. And I was thumbing through Arthur Schlesinger's book on Jack Kennedy, 1,000 Days. And in it he recounts a story that David Reisman once told. And it goes somewhat like this. David Reisman was very, very disturbed about the silent generation that the American schools were producing in the late 1950s. And he said that Reisman was hearing about the undergraduate complaints in the 1950s. And Reisman wrote about these complaints in a sociological journal, and he commented thusly. He said, "When I ask such students what they have done about these things, that is their complaints, they are surprised at the very thought that they could do anything about them. And then I think that they think that I am joking when I suggest that if things come to the worst, they could always pick it. It seems to me that students don't want to believe that their activities might have made a difference." And it does seem ironic that in an 8-year period, we have come from the silent generation of the careful young men to the generation of the committed, the generation of the overcommitted, and in fact the generation of the zealots. It seems as though the Kennedys have been linked to youth. They have spoken to youth. And in a way, it doesn't seem odd that youth and the attraction and affinity of youth to the political was linked with the Kennedys, because the Kennedys spoke to youth. And in speaking to youth, I think that the youth felt that getting active in politics was not something that was a dirty word or a dirty profession, and that politics were no longer a style or a technique or an avocation, if you will, of the suspicious and of the people to be watchful of, but rather it needed a new dedication and a new participation of all. And the Kennedys never really shrinked from this new committed youth, even though they saw things that perhaps they were not greatly in favor of. And Robert Kennedy, 2 years ago on the University of California campus, sort of reaffirmed the dedication and his feeling that the ideas of youth, the ideas of debate, the ideas of dissent still have a very valid and very important place in our way of thinking. And he said 2 years ago at Cal that the right to criticize carries with it a responsibility. And I think that all too often people forget this sort of dual correlative of the freedom of speech, but with the all-important responsibility that goes with it. Kennedy said that the responsibility is to study the facts, to be fully informed. So I would emphasize that we must, in debate and discussion, be aware of the facts, not merely the rhetoric. And those who would criticize have a responsibility. They have a responsibility to listen, to engage in two-way discussion. And over through our history, both in this country and elsewhere, we have seen that it is the extremist who does not permit others to talk and who refuse to engage in discussion. And so if our young people or anyone else for that matter, wishes to criticize, I defend that right. But they must also be willing to listen while others speak. And they must be willing to have their views treated and dealt with in the marketplace of ideals. And I think that this reaffirmation of the whole John Stuart Mill concept of liberty and freedom of speech is rather timely, especially this evening in our forced change circumstances. So with this spirit of the Kennedys and their dedication to the spirit and the belief of the free marketplace of ideas, of debate, of discussion, we commemorate their memory by engaging in this living, ongoing, and I think rather important debate. At the present time, I'd like to call your attention to some minor changes, one major change that is made in the programs that you've had. There has been a change in one of the debaters, and I would like you to add the name of Grace Andrews and cross out the first name that you see on the left-hand side of the list of debaters. I will, at the conclusion of the debate, be very happy to introduce the, I think, fantastic judging staff, as well as the honored guests this evening and the members of the University of California, Berkeley, and Los Angeles staffs. So at the present time, I would like to introduce the debaters, and I will introduce them in the order in which they speak. You will know that there is no indication of the affiliation of schools as to each debater, and this affiliation will be revealed at the conclusion of the debate. The specific resolution is resolved that the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics should move immediately to a mutual disengagement of the Warsaw and NATO alliances to permit the reunification of Germany. And this specific resolution comes from the general problem area of the United States foreign policy towards the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I'd now like to introduce the first affirmative speaker, Mr. Neil Campbell.
In that same speech on the Berkeley campus in 1966, Robert Francis Kennedy also said, "The future does not belong to those who are content with today, apathetic toward common problems and their fellow man alike, timid and fearful in the face of new ideas and bold projects. Rather, it belongs to those who can blend passion, reason, and courage in a personal commitment to ideals and great enterprises. As Plato said, a life without criticism is not worth living." Today I would like to criticize dual policies which I think is leading the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics down the road to what history would indicate would be an inevitable war. But much more than being just an inevitable war, I think that the war which would result if we continue in the present policies would be a war which, as John Kennedy said, might end human life on earth. The dual policies are, of course, one continually having a pact of Warsaw, and on the other hand facing them across the line on the other side of Europe, NATO countries, each armed with weapons, each armed with nuclear weapons, facing each other, trying each other's will, and waiting for the final inevitable conflict. And on the other hand, in the middle of this first conflict, having again, as we've seen in the past, a divided and ununified Germany. Let's talk about that first idea. You know, a lot of debaters give a lot of quotations and evidence, and they tell you, well, from this we see we've proved this, and the other side comes back and says, well, from this evidence, no, we can't see we've proved that, but this. Instead, I'd like to speak to you about the logic of history with regard to that first commitment, and that's this. In 1917, a war resulted in Europe, and it resulted from what? From two opposing alliances, the same thing that we have today. On the one hand, you had the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Italy, later, of course, joined by Russia, and then, still later, the United States of America. And on the other hand, opposing this, you saw Germany, Austria, and Turkey, later, of course, to be joined by other countries in the war that was supposed to end all wars, World War I. Well, it didn't end all wars. The same thing was repeated the next 20 years in World War II. And again preceding World War II, you saw two more alliances formed in Europe. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Note it includes an area not in Europe now, a much bigger span of the war. And on the other side, Britain, France, and Russia, of course later to be joined by the United States, and almost a total commitment of all free democracies in the world. And again they fought, and as a result of these two alliances. But are we being too selective? Are we saying alliances always result in war when they really don't? Do two armed camps inevitably lead to war? I found an interesting quotation in my reading the other day, and I said I wasn't going to give too many of them, and I'm not. But the quotation was from a man named Garrett Mattingly of the London School of Economics. And he said in his book, enticingly titled Renaissance Diplomacy, that, quote, every time two groups of alliances appeared, it was a sure sign that war was inevitable. So even back to the Renaissance, this was what was happening. Every time there were two opposing alliances, war resulted in Europe. And that's the reason, ladies and gentlemen, just that simple. Every time it happens that Europe divides itself into two alliances, that the world divides itself into two alliances, war results. That's the reason I call for the disengagement of NATO and the Warsaw Pacts. Now that second thesis that I promised you that I would talk about, the problem of the reunification of Germany. I think again we can take a historical point of view. Consider the facts. Germany has been unified 3 times in its history. The first time it was unified under the conquering armies of Napoleon. It was a very brief unification, but it was done by war, and that's the key issue. It was unified militarily. It was not unified diplomatically. It was not unified politically. It was not unified by a mutual desire on the part of other nations to see peace in Europe. It was unified by war, and of course the war in Europe was very big. The next time it was unified was a more permanent unification. It was unified, of course, by the military prowess of Prussia under the leadership of the Machiavelli of the 19th century, Mr. Bismarck. And again, it was unified by war. It wasn't unified politically. The other nations in Europe opposed German unification. They had no other way to unify the country but via war, and that's the way they did it, the inevitable way. And of course, after World War I, which resulted from that war for unification, and that war which resulted in the military buildup of Germany and led to other desires on the part of Germany to conquer other nations, Germany was again divided by the Treaty of Versailles. Their nationalist feelings were again taken away from them. And Hitler rose out of that further division of Germany. And the method Hitler used to unify Germany, we all know what that method was. It was the same one that Bismarck had used, the same one that Napoleon had used. Today we see a new rise in Germany after again the disunification of Germany. And that new rise is of a neo-Nazi party that got about 15% of the vote in the last German election, calling for what? The unification of Germany, if necessary via what? The use of arms. I say we can provide a better alternative we can unify Germany politically. And that's the reason I call for German unification in conjunction with the disengagement of the NATO and Warsaw Pacts. As Robert Kennedy said, some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream things that never were and ask, why not?
The first negative speaker is Hyatt Seligman.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start off with a realization that came to being under the Kennedy administration in 1960 to 1963. And it's given to us by John Lukács in his book, A New History of the Cold War. The other unspoken assumption, hardened into a reality by 1961, was that both Americans and Russians had come around to the conclusion that for each, half of Europe was better than none, and that thus disengagement was further away than ever. I'm going to suggest quite simply, there are fantastic stakes at stake in Europe. And because they are so fantastic, and because we do have a relatively stable situation in Europe at this time, I'm going to suggest that the maintenance of the status quo is advantageous over a policy of disengagement seeking to permit the reunification of Germany. But Neil talked about general history. He said it really wasn't such a good idea to bring up specific evidence. I'll agree. I'll deal with his analysis first and then try and give some independent reasons why the idea brought forth today about reunification and disengagement is not actually necessary or advantageous. Now, Neil talked about 1917. He said there was a war because of two opposing alliances. Now, I'm not going to say I'm an expert on World War I or the tremendously complex causes of that war. But from what I do know of that history, the basic failure that caused that war was the refusal of the disclosure of those secret alliances to the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Germany didn't know that England was going to go against her in the outbreak of the war. Well, the war started in 1914. But remember, quite simply, it wasn't merely the fact that there were two alliances, but that those alliances themselves were not announced. I'll suggest the analysis isn't quite adequate to prove always war is going to result. He talked about a new war in the 1940s. Now, I don't know why he said this came from two alliances. I'll turn to a reputable source named Winston Churchill, who said the basic reason why a new war broke out in 1940 was because of the refusal of the Western powers to do what? To keep Germany from entering the Rhineland, to rearm, to become strong once again. I'll suggest it had nothing to do with alliances whatsoever. I'll suggest it had to do with the irresponsibility of the Western powers, and I'll suggest that history should not be repeated in the future. He talked about two opposing alliances always meaning war. He talked about how today there's two opposing alliances. But I think Neil is forgetting about the effect of nuclear weapons, how they freeze alliances, how they literally make it impossible and dangerous to take the risk of general war. I'll suggest his analysis of alliances in the past has little relation to the nuclear reality of today. He said Germany has always been unified by war. You know, I think he's right. And I think that indicates the danger of attempting to reunify Germany today. I'll get to the inherent risks later on. And finally, he said Hitler reunified once again through war. I've dealt with that, turning to Mr. Churchill, turning to the refusal of the Western powers to deal with Mr. Hitler. And that leaves the NPD. He said it was strong. He said it was now a viable force. But he forgets that public opinion polls in Germany show that by a margin of 5-3, Germans themselves believe that security should be put before reunification. And I'll suggest that the Germans realize themselves that if their security is endangered by a process of disengagement or reunification, then whatever the NPD proposes is rather irrelevant. I'll suggest quite simply, it's not a significant problem. It almost sounds like some Russian propaganda. I'll get to that a little later on too. But I promised you some independent reasons why reunification and disengagement aren't really necessary or desirable. Let's get to that first independent argument then, that German reunification is really unnecessary at this time. I didn't hear any significant justification for it. Why do I actually believe it's rather unnecessary? Well, quite simply, I'm going to suggest that crises have been exaggerated as regarding German reunification. We haven't had a major crisis since 1961. That's 8 years. I don't see any significant, inevitable war that's going to come along. I'll suggest the situation is stable. But if we turn to a more detailed analysis, if we turn to Bernard Brodie, formerly of the Rand Corporation, we find that in 1948 in the Berlin airlift and the crises of 1958 and 1961, there was never any real danger to the security of the West or to the Soviet Union. I'll suggest quite simply, we have a stable situation because of this balance, this equilibrium which exists between the Eastern Alliance and the Western Alliance. I'll suggest quite simply, the situation in Berlin is stable. I'll suggest no significant danger, no justification for German reunification. Now I want to stress this idea of an equilibrium of nuclear weapons, because this comes down to that second argument I want to raise, and that is that disengagement is disadvantageous. And the basic premise here is that it's disadvantageous because it threatens that equilibrium. It threatens that equilibrium. And I want to indicate that neither of the superpowers, and remember it takes two to disengage, two to disentangle, neither of these superpowers should take the risk or can take the risk of disengagement or German reunification if it threatens to undermine their basic security, threatens to have them lose their half a loaf of Europe. All right then, what are some of these risks regarding disengagement in Europe? Well, I believe the United States faces two basic risks. The first of these is the establishment of a power vacuum in Central Europe. If we turn to former foreign minister of France, Coup de Mourville, he points out in 1964 that a disengagement from Europe by United States forces and the Soviet Union forces would be a matter of utter survival to Europe, for it would leave only a matter of a few hundred miles away the armies of the Soviet Union against the powers of France, Italy, Belgium, and Luxembourg. I'll suggest quite simply, the danger of a power vacuum, the risk entailed is just too much for the United States to risk destroying that equilibrium. There's a second reason, and that is the deterrence of the United States would be undermined in Europe. This is indicated by Thomas Schelling, a professor of political science at Harvard. He indicates that in Berlin we have a garrison of only 12,000 men. But that garrison acts as a tripwire to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union knows that if it attacks that garrison, there is going to be a direct response from the United States. Well, what happens if you take those troops away and put them in the United States? You haven't got that tripwire, you haven't got that deterrence. Two basic reasons why that equilibrium can very easily shift in favor of the Soviet Union, a risk the United States cannot take when Europe is at stake. Interestingly enough, though, the Soviet Union also faces risks to its security in Europe also. And I believe there are also two here. The first is the loss of control over its satellites. Do I need to remind you about Czechoslovakia, about Hungary, about the direct control which the Soviet Union demands as basic security over Eastern Europe to its own national interest? I don't think I need to. I'll suggest quite simply that the Soviet Union, under no circumstances, looking into its own interest and perception, cannot disengage from Europe and risk losing control over its Soviet hegemony in Eastern Europe. There's a second reason, though, once again. And I want to stress here the fear which the Soviet Union has of Germany. Remember I talked about the lessons of war, the lessons of World War I. Remember I talked about how after World War I, there was a refusal of the Western powers to police and restrict Hitler from entering the Rhineland and restrict the armed forces of Germany. And Russia remembers this, and she remembers that she lost over 7 million lives because of that poor enforcement policy. I'll suggest Russia knows the lessons of history, and she cannot allow the risk that a neutralized Germany or a weak Germany could once again become rearmed. I'll suggest quite simply, Russia has significant risks in disengagement which indicate that it, under no circumstances, can follow a policy of disengagement. So what have I done? I've basically shown you independent reasons, first of all, why German reunification is unnecessary, why disengagement is disadvantageous because it risks upsetting that vital balance of power in Europe. I've indicated that really the historical analysis of Neil was right, or was nice, but not quite accurate, does not justify the significant change he advocates. I therefore think we should reject this proposal.
The second affirmative speaker is Grace Andrews.
Neil spoke to you about the logic of history. I'm not so sure that history really is logical. And then Hyatt told you that Neil did not apply his arguments to the nuclear situation, and that's true. What I'm going to suggest, however, is that in opposition to Neil's argument in favor of this proposal, that military considerations are important in considering world stability. For the classic interpretation of world peace is meaningless. Permanent settlement, that's what Neil is advocating to you, is unrealistic today because the ideological struggle indicates the basic incompatibility between the two most powerful nations. The most tenable goal for the United States and the Soviet Union, then, is not permanent settlement, but is world stability. Yet, according to Stanley Hoffman, a divided Germany precludes that very stability. He points out, all the Allies realize that the main threat to European security results from the fact that Germany is divided into two hostile entities, and that the status of Berlin is uncertain. The status quo in Central Europe is untenable in the long run and risky in the short run. So to best implement our commitment to coexistence, the United States and the Soviet Union should immediately withdraw or disengage from Europe in order to permit the reunification of Germany. I think that this entails three policy revisions. First, that the United States and the Soviet Union should immediately withdraw from German territory. Second, that they should mutually but gradually disengage ground troops from Europe. And third, that a new German state should remain neutral and non-aligned. Now, the phrase world stability contains two notions. First, it contains a notion of the analysis of power. Stability derives from a recognition of the opponent's power and the consequences of the use of that power. This is commonly called the deterrence philosophy. But furthermore, stability operates on the principle of mutual understanding. This suggests the advantage of clear, direct communication between the great powers. Any alteration, then, either a decrease in power or a disruption of communication, upsets world stability. These conditions, then, indicate that the best way to increase stability is to establish a more viable deterrent and to promote mutual understanding. A policy of disengagement and reunification favorably affects these two conditions. It creates a more viable deterrent and promotes mutual understanding. So although the resolution may not preclude conflict in the future, it does contribute to world stability. The proposal permits a more viable deterrent for two reasons. First, it minimizes the opportunity for crisis, and second, it promotes consolidations of power. In a discussion, we find that the opportunity for conflict is decreased in two ways. First, it dismantles a crisis situation. Gerald Fune notes that the resolution of crisis in Europe is inconceivable except in the solution to the German problem, the division of Germany. However, the reunification of Germany eliminates the structural problem of Berlin and thus dismantles a crisis situation. This directly decreases the opportunity for conflict. But the proposal also decreases the incentive to intervene. Now the threat of German and American aggression dictates a massive Soviet presence in Europe. This often aggravates the satellite countries. But as Professor Hartman relates, the Soviet Union really only has two alternatives in relation to its satellite nations. It can either liberalize those satellites in the face of the threat, or it can liquidate the satellites. The Czech crisis indicates the opportunity or the alternative that the Soviet Union has selected, that of liquidation, because liberalization of the satellites in consideration of the American and German threat really is no alternative to the Soviet Union. Yet if the United States disengages from Europe and minimizes her threat, then the Soviet Union will no longer have to have a massive troop presence in the areas of East Europe. The probability of continuing Czech crises will be minimized. There will be a less opportunity for continuing intervention of the Soviet Union. This eliminates a source of conflict because the satellite countries and the United States will no longer be provoked to respond to Soviet interventions. We directly minimize the crisis. We dismantle the structural problem of Berlin, and we minimize the opportunity for conflict in the area of Soviet interventions. This gives us a more viable deterrent. However, the proposal creates a more viable deterrent by promoting consolidations of power among the great powers. First, the United States' position will become more viable because her foreign policy will be more credible. Remember, Neil told you that the United States is committed to German reunification. If the United States fulfills that commitment, our foreign policy becomes more credible. But the significance of this is maximized because the Soviet Union and the countries of Europe realized that the United States had to make concessions to fulfill that commitment. So the argument that the United States only acts in our national security interests is falsified, and our foreign policy becomes more credible. That's a consolidation of power, and that enhances our deterrent force. But the consolidation of power is also shared by the Soviet Union, for the Soviet Union has a commitment to neutralize Germany. German reunification and a neutralized Germany would be the fulfillment of a Soviet foreign policy goal. So her position gains more credibility. Furthermore, as Professors Cottrell and Doherty note, the Soviet willingness to maintain or permit German self-determination enhances the Soviet image among her satellite countries. This consolidates her power, and this produces a more viable deterrent. Thus, the mutual consolidation of power does allow for a more viable deterrent. But the proposal accrues another advantage. It does promote mutual understanding. Reunification and disengagement increase mutual concern in two ways. First, it establishes direct channels of communication. Now the Soviet Union and the United States, when communicating foreign policy intents to one another in the area of Germany, have to communicate through Berlin, through the divided German situation. There's a confusion. There are not direct channels of communication. Yet Professor Schelling of Harvard points out that direct channels of communication in a nuclear situation promote mutual understanding. And mutual understanding is the basis of the deterrent in the nuclear age. But second, the proposal clarifies the position of the great powers. Remember now, the United States is committed to German reunification, but we aren't affecting any movement toward German reunification. Likewise, the Soviet Union is committed to German neutralization, but they aren't doing anything about German neutralization. Then the Soviet Union doesn't know how committed the Russians are to their goal, and the United States doesn't know how committed the Soviet Union is to its goal. This is a confusion in the international realm of politics. By effecting German reunification, we are no longer committed to a paper policy, and we do clarify the position of the great powers, and this promotes mutual understanding. So what have I done? I've defined the level of stability in the nuclear age and demonstrated that reunification and disengagement enhances that very stability. I'd like to conclude with the logic of George Kennan rather than the logic of history. It seems more desirable to get the Soviet forces out of East and Central Europe than to cultivate a new German army for the purpose of opposing them while they remain there. What I'd like to do in perspective to Hyatt's analysis is make the very point that all Hyatt's logic depends on one thing, whether or not the Germans believe that the Soviets are going to aggress on Germany, or whether or not there is any credibility in either the foreign policy of the United States or the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. What I've demonstrated to you, however, is that actually a disengagement and reunification encourages the credibility of both nations, and we really don't have the problem in terms of the power vacuum that Hyatt talked about. So in the interests of stability, I argue for German reunification and mutual disengagement in the German area. So in the interests of stability, I argue for German reunification and mutual disengagement in the German area.
The last constructive speaker and the second negative speaker as well is Mr. Bruce Minke.
I should like to begin by starting off with several different points. And the first of these is going to be simply, is it desirable or is it not to reunify Germany? Now here I should like to go into, first of all, Neil's analysis of the problem. And much to the contrary of everybody else, I am not going to be presenting any marvelous quotes in today's debate. But rather I should like to bring forward one minor quote from Jonathan Winters, who is very well renowned. He was imposing himself to be an opera star and was asked what the difference was between Italian opera and German opera. And his statement was, well, in Italian opera, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back again, they live happily ever after. Said in German opera, boy gets girl, boy marries girl, and boy and girl go off together to invade Poland. Well, believe it or not, this has a relevance to Neil's first point. And it has relevance to my first point, that being, is it desirable to reunify Germany? Now, first of all, Neil has pointed out here that many wars have arisen because people have desired to reunify their country. But the point I should like to bring to today's debate is just how far would this reunification go? Would it simply stop with the reunification which the present big powers, the United States and Russia, could allow? Or would this desire merely be begun by such action and continue? Remember that today, mainly East Germany and parts of Western Germany too, have been split up far beyond what they originally were when Hitler knew them. Also the fact that the Austrians are considered German people, the line, the Oder-Neisse line in Czechoslovakia, the areas of Prussia, Poland, and so forth. These areas obviously could not be reunified under any program which the affirmative would offer to you today. And yet, if Neil's contention is right, then we're going to have to conclude that the German people's desire for reunification would be so strong that it would continue well beyond the area which we could reunify. And therefore, instead of giving them what we want, we would merely be initiating a program which we do not desire to initiate, and as such be opening up Pandora's box. Furthermore, I should like to go into the possibilities of simply, can it happen? Even if Neil's and his partner's viewpoint were to be accepted, and it were desirable to reunify Germany, could it really come about in today's world? In other words, I think we have to be somewhat practical in the debate today. First of all, let's analyze this from the Soviet viewpoint. Here we're going to find several interesting factors. Do the Soviets really want reunification? Well, look at Hungary. We saw here that when Hungary threatened to leave the Warsaw Pact, which is a large portion of today's debate, the disengagement from the Warsaw Pact, when Hungary tried this, they were immediately invaded by Soviet troops. We've seen even more recently when the Czechoslovaks decided merely to have loan agreements with the Western power in Western Germany, that again, they were invaded as being way too liberal. So I think we have to conclude then that the Soviet Union does not want a disengagement from the Warsaw Pact. Furthermore, they pointed out, well, that the only real reason that the Soviets had their satellites was to counteract the United States and Western powers' threat in Europe today. But is this really true? Would the Soviets be willing to give up these satellite countries upon the disengagement or the reunification of Germany? Again here, I think the point in view in Czechoslovakia showed that they are not willing to give it up. They're not even willing to liberalize it, but they need these countries for other reasons, which I might propose would be economic to their own well-being. They need a economic basis and so forth here. From here then, I should like to move into the idea of what would happen from the United States viewpoint. First of all, we find that the United States, as you'll recall, wouldn't even sign a non-proliferation treaty with the Russians after their moving into Czechoslovakia. What gives Neil and his partner the idea that they could have a total disengagement from NATO immediately as the resolution calls for? In other words, if the United States is not willing to communicate or to go along that well with the Russians, as is evident in the non-proliferation treaty, why would we do it for the entire disengagement from the entire NATO pact immediately? Again, what about the idea of NATO? The whole idea for having our troops in Europe is that the Russian troops could move back from their buffer zone, from their Eastern European satellites, several hundred miles into Russia. And yet they would still have all the mobilization tendencies they needed. They would still have the strength they needed. But if the United States moves back, we have to go clear back across the ocean, and this is one of the fears of the United States, that by the time we could get any troops over there, in case anything did happen, that we would not be in a situation to do anything. The Russians would have already taken over. Last of all, I should like to bring up a point which has already been introduced in today's debate, that simply being the idea of credibility. I would like to pose the question of what would happen to the United States' credibility and its treaties and so forth if it removes troops which it told the countries of Western Europe it would maintain. Now, Western Germany presently has asked us to continue having our troops in that country. They have asked us to do it in spite of the tremendous burden we have with the Vietnamese War. And so from this, I have to think that our credibility would only be strengthened by the remainder of those troops there, especially since they are asking for it at present. Last of all, on my third point, I should like to go into the plan which has been presented by the second member of the affirmative team. I should like to ask how you can possibly reunify a country which has been divided into two parts for at least 20 years. Two parts which are entirely separate in ideology and are polarized. What kind of a government would you have upon unification? Can you expect the East Germans to agree with the West Germans upon all points? Could they actually have an effective foreign policy of any kind? Furthermore, if the countries were, let's say, be won over to the Western point of view, which is feasible since the Western portion of the country is much larger than the Eastern portion, what would Russia have to say about this? A large portion of their strategy is presently based upon having a stronghold in East Germany. But now this country, we can assume, would not just be neutral, but would have to be westernized, since the majority of the people there do have the Western mode of thinking. With this in mind, then, these three major points. Number one, that it is not desirable. Number two, that theoretically it might be desirable in some ways, but that it really can't happen in the light of world affairs, in view of the Russian viewpoint, in view of the United States viewpoint, and in view of the fact that the plan itself is not a workable one due to the division which has lasted for so many years. I should like to go into several of the points brought up mainly by the second affirmative speaker. She pointed out here, first of all, the idea of better communication between the United States and Russia, that we would know exactly where each country stood and exactly how far each country was willing to go. My question here is, would a world policy really function if this came about? Or does a world policy to a large degree function by the fact that Russians really don't know how far we're willing to go in Eastern Europe, or Western Europe rather, to defend it, or how far we're willing to go in Vietnam? My point being that by letting them know exactly how far you're willing to go, they're going to go that far. So I think here that communication would never really build up to the level that the affirmative member would have you believe. As far as U.S. foreign policy, so that would make it more credible. I think I've already stressed the point that this is not necessarily true, that quite to the contrary, we would have to break commitments which we have already brought about. In my rebuttal speech, I will try to go back more into the speeches of the other members and will try and show you how I do not believe that they are practical. So in conclusion then, I hope that you will agree, number one, that at this time anyway in our history, that the reunification of Germany is not wholly desirable, and that moreover, it is not at all practical.
Mr. Menke's remarks end the constructive phase of this debate And we'll pause for a few moments while the debaters organize and finalize their rebuttal arguments. Are there still some outside? Oh, wait. As many of you may know, the time allotted to each individual speaker in this debate is 15 minutes, and he may use this time in any means he wants to, with one major stipulation, that being that he use no more than 7 minutes in his rebuttal. The time remaining for each individual speaker, therefore, is as follows. Mr. Campbell has 7 minutes remaining, Mr. Seligman has 6.5 minutes, Ms. Andrews has 4 minutes and 15 seconds, and Mr. Menke has 6.5 minutes remaining. As you also probably know, we reverse orders from the constructive to the rebuttal, and the rebuttal starts first with a negative and then is followed by an affirmative speaker. The first negative rebuttal is Mr. Seligman with 6.5 minutes.
I'd like to start off by getting to Grace's argument, seeing as how she came after me. I'd like to start off with her first statement that a divided Germany is always uncertain. I don't think she dealt with my basic issue, looking at a historical analysis that really, according to Mr. Brody, there really haven't been crises which have affected the very security of the United States and the Soviet Union. They may have garnered publicity, but at no time was there a serious threat to your security or my security. The superpowers tread cautiously and warily because of the significant balance of power and the terror involved in nuclear warfare. I'll suggest quite simply there's no justification for German reunification. But Grace, first of all, as her basic argument, talked about a more viable deterrent. But remember what I told you would happen to that deterrent and the tripwire if those troops were gone. I said that deterrent would be undermined, and I don't think Grace dealt with that. With our troops back in the United States, there's no tripwire, there's no impregnable fortress which Mr. Schelling talked about. I'll suggest quite simply we're not going to have a more viable deterrent. She talked about minimizing the opportunity of crisis and dismantling the crisis area. I'm going to suggest the exact opposite. I'm going to turn to Zbigniew Brzezinski. It's a tough name to say, but he works for the State Department, or used to, and he's a professor of political science at Harvard. And he said that disengagement would create a vacuum which would open up vast new hunting grounds for East and West. Tension areas would be increased. We can turn to Dean Acheson, former Secretary of State, who said it would make a no-man's land which would raise tensions far above anything yet seen. They seem to be in basic agreement. You disengage and the tension areas increase, those risks are increased, and that equilibrium is endangered. I'll suggest quite simply we're not going to eliminate that structural crisis area, we're just going to enlarge it. All right, then she said there was going to be no threat to our satellites through a process of disengagement. But she assumed that the reason why the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia was because of an external threat of NATO aggression against Czechoslovakia. I'll suggest the case it was a matter of liberalization in the internal affairs of Czechoslovakia, something which could occur whether or not NATO troops are there, and as Ferencz Valley pointed out recently, no Soviet leader would be willing to preside over the liquidation of the Soviet Communist Empire. Quite simply, whether we disengage or not, the Soviet Union is not going to think it is in its security interest to leave those satellites on their own to remove their troops. Secondly, she talked about promoting a consolidation of power under this argument of increased deterrent. I'm going to suggest there's a slight contradiction here. Somehow Grace is saying, well, there's going to be an increase in the consolidation of power regarding a rhetorical question of credibility. At the same time, the Soviet Union dismantles its power in Eastern Europe. I'll suggest that the practical power, which really should be dealing with consolidation of power, is the troop levels of the Soviet Union. I don't think that its consolidation of power is enhanced by somehow helping its credibility, whatever that may mean. I'll suggest then Grace's first argument about a more viable deterrent just isn't valid. I'll suggest we're not going to accrue that through her proposal. She secondly said we should promote mutual understanding. She talked about establishing direct channels of communication, clarifying the position of superpowers. But ask yourselves this basic question. What does this have to do with disengagement or German reunification? Do we have to disengage? Do we have to reunify Germany to indicate the Soviet Union what our true position is? Can't we tell them? Our true position is that we don't want to disengage. Our true position is that we don't want to reunify Germany. Our true position is that we like this half a loaf of Europe, Mr. I guess it's Kosygin and Brezhnev. I'll suggest quite simply this contention really has little to do with the process of disengagement and German reunification. I'll suggest it can be achieved under the status quo through a few more meetings, through the maintenance of the balance of power under the present system. Grace finally said that the basic issue was, will the Soviets aggress on Germany? This is the issue on the debate, she said. And I'll suggest she just may be right. In fact, I'll agree. And I'm going to say, well, let's see. If the Soviet Union does desire to aggress on Germany, I'll suggest we certainly don't want disengagement. That's certainly a disadvantageous condition. If the Soviet Union likes the present situation and isn't going to aggress on Germany, I'll suggest quite simply disengagement is unnecessary. It's unnecessary or undesirable, however you look at it. I'll suggest quite simply the present situation is most advantageous. That leaves then Bruce's remarks. I basically agree with Bruce's position that we shouldn't have disengagement, but I disagree slightly with his analysis. For really, I feel he really wasn't dealing with the prime issues in today's debate. I think the prime objections to disengagement and German reunification aren't the technicalities of how many Germans are German, or can the Russians do what they want. I think the affirmative is arguing this is what the Russians should want, not maybe they will want it. He talked about the credibility being hurt by removing troops. I don't really think that's the basic issue at hand. I think the basic issue is whether or not there are going to be those risks which I talked about on my first stand on the floor, basic security risks to the two superpowers involved, which indicate that under no circumstances, whether or not we could identify Germans or not, whether or not it was possible to reunify Germany, that particular situation, that particular goal is untenable, undesirable, and disadvantageous. That brings me then to my own original independent arguments, which really haven't been dealt with, unfortunately, because I wanted to extend them a little more. But let me remind you of them to indicate, basically, the prime stakes we have under the present system, and first, why German reunification is unnecessary at this time. We don't have serious crises. We've never had our basic peace and security violated or threatened through the present balance of power and equilibrium, which I'm talking about. I'm just suggesting there really isn't any significant advantage to be gained. I think we've lived in peace for 24 years. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't have this stable situation for another 24 years or another 100 years. Let's look at that second argument I raised, the disadvantageousness, the undermining of United States deterrence, establishment of vacuums, the risk to the Soviet Union, a resurgent Germany and the fear which this inculcates in the Soviet Union, and the loss of control over their satellites. Remember, it takes two to disentangle. I haven't seen any significant reasons why the two superpowers should view it in their interest to disentangle from Europe to reunify Germany. I'll suggest quite simply, the status quo is satisfactory. I suggest we maintain it.
The first affirmative rebuttal speaker with 7 minutes left is Mr. Campbell.
Characteristically of me, I'd like to go backwards in this debate. We'll start with Mr. Menke's arguments and we'll work back to my position as they were presented in the constructive. Mr. Menke started his arguments with a joke. He told you about the German boy and girl invading Poland, which reminds me of what you get if you eat German and Chinese food. 2 hours later, you're hungry for power. You see, what it amounts to is this. We have Mr. Menke, a German note, German name, telling you about the warlike and mean Germans. You hear Mr. Menke telling you that the Germans are always warlike and mean, that they always invade Poland. And what he never asks himself is why. Why do they invade Poland? Because they want to get back parts of what are Germany. If Germany was unified politically, why would they invade Poland? I could tell you a bunch of Polish jokes to illustrate the point, but I won't belabor it. Next, Mr. Menke told you that we've got to ask us the question, could this be done? Could we really unify Germany? That's like saying, could we really desegregate the schools in the South? It doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. Just because it's hard to do, just because it's difficult, doesn't mean we shouldn't. And that's what we're debating today, is whether we should do it. And I don't think that argument really tells us we shouldn't. It really tells us that we should, because the things that we should count most on doing are those things that are most difficult to do, because those are the things that bring about the greatest problems, or they wouldn't be difficult to change. Next we go back to the lady's argument on the affirmative. Though I agree with her position, generally, I don't agree with her specific analysis at all. She told you that a permanent settlement of the problems between East and West is unrealistic, which means instead that we should work for a temporary settlement. We should try and hide it a little bit under the rug and hope that it'll go away with a temporary settlement of the problem. I don't think so at all. The best thing would be to have this permanent settlement. And again, it goes back to the idea. Sure, it's difficult to do. It's far more difficult to have a permanent solution than it is to have a temporary solution, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't move toward a permanent solution, not a temporary one, not one which brushes the problem under the rug. And then we come to the arguments of the first negative speaker. He told us that Europe is divided into two halves of a loaf. Now, if you have a loaf, in order to make it valuable, what do you have to do with it? If you have a loaf of bread, for instance, you have to eat it, right? And once you've eaten half a loaf, don't you want to eat the other loaf too? And that's the problem here. If you have half a loaf, the desire's there to eat it. And when you start eating it, you've got the problem of wanting to go all the way and eating the other half of the loaf. And that's where his argument breaks down. You know, he told you that we haven't had any major crises since 1961. Shh. Nobody tell him about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nobody tell him about the nuclear war we nearly had. Nobody tell him that right at this moment, the East Germans are trying to keep land forces from going through to Berlin at the very moment that President Nixon is going to be in Berlin next week. Nobody tell him that. Come on. We've had serious crises since 1961. We've almost had a nuclear war. We're in the middle of a serious crisis right now. That position isn't tenable at all. It just doesn't make sense in light of the current realities. It doesn't make sense in light of what's been going on in the world since 1961. What's Vietnam if it isn't a crisis between East and West? Why are we there unless we think the East, the Soviet meanies, are trying to take over the government of South Vietnam? Obviously there's tension between East and West. That's why we're there. That's why we're there. But no, we shouldn't be, because we can alleviate that tension. If we do, and if we look at history, we can learn that that's what's caused the tension in the first place, and that's where the problem lies. Let's turn back to that historical perspective then that I wanted to present. First, I told you that two armed camps have always led to war. The only argument I heard on that from any of the speakers was that, well, in 1917, it was the problem that these were secret armed camps. Sure, a secret armed camp is more dangerous than one which is out in the open just because it's secret. But it doesn't mean there still isn't a problem from there being an armed camp. And did you ever hear any of the speakers tell you that two armed camps don't always lead to war? And that's the key idea here. Two armed camps, ever since the Renaissance, have always led to war, and nobody in this debate can deny that premise. And so we come to my second premise. We come to the idea of why we should unify Germany. I told you that Germany's been unified 3 times in the past, but it's always been done militarily. And why has it always been done militarily? Because we've always been unwilling to do it politically. Now, the only argument that I heard really seriously leveled against this point was Mr. Menke's argument, well, you've got to include the other parts of Germany. And that's difficult to do. Sure, it's difficult. But if we're going to do it, why don't we go all the way? Why don't we unify in one big Germany all of the rest of Germany? He didn't tell you that we couldn't do that. He didn't tell you that we shouldn't do that. He told you that it was a problem. Sure, it's a problem. That's why we're debating it. I think perhaps John Kennedy summed up the challenge before us best when he said, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human misery and all forms of human life. I suggest that we try and abolish all forms of human misery.
The last negative speaker for the evening, with 6.5 minutes remaining, is Mr. Bruce Menke.
In my last speech, I would like to reaffirm my position in today's debate. Number one, that I don't really think it's desirable to reunite Germany, and number two, that even if it were, the resolution goes too far in demanding the entire withdrawal from the NATO and the Warsaw Pact. As a result, I feel that we would create an unstable position instead of that stable one desired by the members of the affirmative. Now, perhaps it's a little catching, or perhaps it's a little personal. I would like to go back words too, like Neil just did, and go into his speech first. From here, we found the very first thing that Neil pointed out was that the Germans, as I had pointed out, were always warlike and mean. Then he pointed out that my name was Menke. Well, I should like to point out to Neil that I was stepfather, and that really I'm from the Ewan clan of Scotland, you see. But continuing on from here, he said, why didn't I ever look into the fact of why they want Poland back? They want it back because it was theirs. And then he went into this analysis of, if you get a half a loaf, you want the whole loaf. Well, this is the point I was trying to make earlier. That if you give the Germans anything short of the Austria, of Prussia, of the line above the Oder-Neisse, the whole thing, they're going to want the remainder of that loaf. And as such, they are going to continue, and a war probably could result. Furthermore, a war could very easily result if Germany was built into the proportions that Neil wants it built. Presently, East Germany is the strongest country in the Warsaw Pact area. West Germany is the strongest one in the western area of Europe. So what are you creating? You're creating a fantastic monolith with tremendous economic and potential military powers. And with that background, if it ever wanted that little portion of the loaf, it could certainly take it. From here, though, Neil went on and he said, well, it's hard, but it's kind of like the schools in the South. You know, we could do it. Well, what about the other areas in Europe? Is Poland going to want a little chunk taken off? Is Austria going to want to become suddenly all German? Now, are the Czechoslovaks going to be willing to give up parts of their countries? Remember, these just haven't been conceded to them yesterday. But these are parts of their countries that they have had for 20, 30 years. What's going to happen here? From here, he went on and he said, well, really, we have had a lot of problems, and contrary to the first negative speaker. It says we have almost had a nuclear war in Cuba. But what prevented that nuclear war in Cuba? The fantastic deterrent of the United States. And I might point out, not only the deterrent of the United States based here at home, but that based very close to the Soviet Union. Continuing on, though, Neil said, have we ever heard anything to the extent that two armed camps don't always lead to war? Well, here I'm going to have to agree again with that first negative speaker when he stated that in today's world, nuclear camps stabilize the situation. They don't necessarily lead to war anymore. They don't necessarily lead to an easy peace, mind you. But they don't necessarily lead to war. Not with the tremendous destructive capabilities that we presently have. His last point, which was the major one of his constructive speech, was a need to unify. Again, that we must have both parts brought together. Again, as I've already pointed out, do you want that situation created with the half loaf? And moreover, the other points that I brought up. The difficulties. Why would the Russians want to unify? They have everything to lose. They lose the economy of East Germany. They lose the people of East Germany. The country becomes pro-Western. So what happens there? So why would the Russians go along with it? And if they can point out why the Russians would go along with it, then why would the Western countries go along with it? Because somebody has got to lose in the present situation. Now from here I should like to go back into the second affirmative speaker's main constructive, which I didn't have time to hit last time. They pointed out here a fantastic need. She said that stability arises from recognition of power and so on and so on. Well, I've already agreed to this, that you do need the power there, and once it's recognized, you do have stability. But they said we would have a more viable deterrent if we were to remove our troops. Now, it's a little hard to understand how you would have a stronger deterrent with nothing there to deter with. But they pointed out that you would have a less chance of conflict because no troops would be involved. Again, this idea of a tripwire. The Russians aren't going to go near West Berlin because of our troops. if we have to send troops in to push the Russians out next week because they did invade, then you're going to have a war. So there's no need to intervene if it's a nuclear-free zone in a neutral area. But again, what would happen here? What would happen the minute, let's say, that this neutral area of Germany were just infiltrated just through the government by communists? We would have to assume that the United States would not agree with the idea, or vice versa. What happened if it started going very pro-Western? What would the Russians have to say about the situation? Because that neutrality that they have claimed would come about is not an enforceable neutrality. How can you make a country be neutral if it doesn't necessarily want to be neutral? Continuing on from here, though, he said that, well, Russia can't liberalize its satellites presently because of the need for protection from the West. Again, was Russia being protected or needing protection from the West when it went into Czechoslovakia? Was that the reason it went into Hungary? Or are there other reasons involved? I think you're going to find the reason is that Russia just period does not want to liberalize them. So from here they went down into the idea of Germany. It'd be great prestige for Russia if it could liberate Germany. Why would Russia liberate Germany when a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago it sent troops into Czechoslovakia? Doesn't that seem to be rather incongruous with the facts as they now stand? Last of all, this point here again of the better communication, as has been pointed out by one negative speaker, you could be more truthful and solve the problem that way. And as I pointed out, why would you want better communication? Why do you want to tell them everything that you are planning? Politics, I don't believe, exactly work in that manner. So with this in mind, then, I would like to go back into that original speech of mine, and I should like to show what still remains. First of all, I pointed out that it is not desirable to reunite Germany. It is not desirable because of the fantastic problems involved in the way of reunifying the large country and of the problems that would be involved as far as opening a Pandora's box, giving them the power with which to continue their expansion. Second of all, I pointed out it couldn't happen from the Soviet viewpoint because of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the fact that they just don't want to lose East Germany. It's very important to them economically and militarily. Then I turned to the United States viewpoint. We won't even agree with the Russians on a proliferation treaty. Why will we do it on getting completely out of NATO? For that matter, look at President Nixon. He's going there right now, not to weaken NATO immediately, but to strengthen it. So in viewpoint of these factors then, I do hope that you will concur with my stand that it is not desirable to reunite Germany and that the resolution goes way too far in its method.
The last speaker of this debate, the second affirmative speaker, is Ms. Grace Andrews with 4 minutes and 15 seconds remaining.
Is there a justification for change? Notice that Hyatt tells you that crisis has been exaggerated in Berlin. What does that prove? There's a high tension level in Germany, a high tension level that could break forth to a real crisis situation. The situation then is unstable, and in the terms of stability, we should opt for German reunification rather than pursuing our present policy. Remember, Mr. Hoffman told you that a divided Germany precludes stability, and yet none of these speakers ever responded to that basic premise. What did the first affirmative tell you, though? That we should have permanent peace. Now this reminds me of Don Quixote, because all the gentleman's analysis applies to the non-nuclear age. But remember, now we have nuclear weapons. There's a threat of massive retaliations and total destruction. And remember the ideology that dictates the basic incompatibility between the Soviet Union and the United States. There can never be permanent peace, and the only thing we can hope for is world stability. And that's why I argue for German reunification and mutual disengagement for two comparative advantages. First, because we'll have a more viable deterrent. Now, the only argument contrary to this is the argument of the tripwire. But analyze that for a minute. Why is it necessary to have a tripwire or a troop presence in Europe? Because the Soviets fear the United States, and because the United States fears the Soviet Union. But if we disengage from Europe, that symbolizes a willingness not to pursue an active policy of intervention. In other words, there's no threat, and we don't need that troop commitment. But how do we get a more viable deterrent? We minimize the opportunity for crisis, for we dismantle the situation in Berlin, and we decrease the Soviet incentive to intervene. Now, Hyatt told you about the power vacuums in the Soviet Union, in the East European area if the United States and the Soviet Union disengage. There's nothing inherently wrong with the power vacuum, however. It could act as a buffer state. It could act as an area of neutrality, and there's nothing inherently harmful about that. But remember what I told you. The symbolic opportunity of disengagement minimizes the opportunity for crisis, and none of the gentlemen really wish to deal with that situation. But what about minimizing the incentive to intervene? Now notice, every one of the speakers here have indicated the Czechoslovakian crisis. Yet I quoted to you Mr. Hartman, who said, the reason why the Soviet Union remains in East Europe in a massive troop presence because of the threat of the United States. But if the United States withdraws, there's no threat. There's no need for that troop commitment, and we minimize the incentive for the Soviet Union to intervene. We minimize the opportunity for crisis. What about promoting consolidations of power? Nobody really dealt with that either. But power is based on the credibility of our response. Not that we will respond with troops, but that we will respond with the ultimate weapon, and that is the nuclear weapon. Mr. Kissinger in the Troubled Partnership says that there is no doubt that the United States will respond in Europe if the Soviet Union aggresses. We do have a credible position, both the United States and the Soviet Union does, and we have a more viable deterrent. So what about that second comparative advantage, promoting mutual understanding? We're going to have direct channels of communication. The second negative speaker told you about the uncertainty principle. But that only applies to the uncertainty of response, not to the uncertainty of our position. Our foreign policy position is clarified, and we promote mutual understanding. So for two reasons of comparative advantage, we'll have a more viable deterrent, and we'll promote mutual understanding. We can hope for stability. Let's unify Germany and gradually disengage from Europe.
As you can see, Ms. Andrews' remarks end the official portion of the debate, and I'm sure that we'd all like to thank all of the debaters for presenting a very thought-provoking evening. Before the judges start their deliberations, I'd like to introduce them to you, and it really gives me a distinct honor to do so because I think in my years of debating, this is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the most singularly qualified panel of judges that we have had, and I'm sure that others who have debated would certainly agree with me. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Carlton Goodlett, the publisher of the Sun Reporter. Dr. Goodlett. Next, Dr. Harlan Hogue, who is the Carl Patton Professor of Homiletics at the Pacific School of Religion. Dr. Hogue. The next judge is the Honorable Thomas Lynch, who is the Attorney General of the State of California. The next judge, who is a judge, is the Honorable Stanley Mosk, who is the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the State of California. Our final judge to round out this excellent panel is Sister Gertrude Patch, the President of San Francisco College for Women. At this point, I'd like to introduce the staffs of the forensic organizations of both the University of California at Los Angeles and the University of California, Berkeley. And it is due to the efforts of these staffs that we could have presented debaters in a program of such high sophistication as we did this evening. First of all, from the University of California at Los Angeles, the Director of Forensics, Mrs. Patricia Long. Mrs. Long. and Mrs. Long's associate, the Assistant Director of Forensics, Ms. Benita McCracken. And now the staff of the University of California, Berkeley. First of all, the Director of Forensics at Cal, Dr. Fred Stripp. Stripp. His co-director of forensics is Mr. Ward Tabler. Mr. Tabler. And the assistants to the directors of forensics at Berkeley, Mr. Mike Buckley, Mr. Terry O'Reilly, and Mr. William Weissner. In addition to the Berkeley staff that I've just mentioned, we have the chairman of the Department of Rhetoric with us this evening, Dr. Leonard Nathan. Dr. Nathan? It's always a temptation while the judges are deliberating for an ex-debater to present his third affirmative or third negative rebuttal, and I will refrain from this evening. I'd just like to say that I hope, in view of the excellence of debate here and also of the ideas that the Kennedys thought of and exemplified, that when the 7th annual Kennedy Medal will be presented at Cal in 2 years, that the logic of freedom of speech, the logic of reason, of discussion, of debate will prevail over the politics of the street, and so that we can again hold it in Dwinell East. Before I announce the winner of the debate, I'd like to identify the speakers and correlate them with their respective schools. First of all, Ms. Andrews is from the University of California at Los Angeles. Mr. Campbell is from the University of California at Berkeley. Mr. Menke is from the University of California at Berkeley. And Mr. Seligman is from the University of California at Los Angeles. Dr. Stripp informs me that the balloting was so close this time that 1 point separated all of the 4 places, which is probably the first time that's happened. The winner of the debate from the University of California at Los Angeles, Mr. Hyatt Seligman. And I'd like to present to Mr. Seligman at this time the Kennedy Medal, which is a rather nice award for this debate. And I think some of you have seen it. It's passed around before. Get this here. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.
That concludes the 5th annual Kennedy Memorial Debate. I'd like to thank all of you for your cooperation and apologize if the change of site inconvenienced you in any way. We thank you again, and hopefully you will all be back with us in 2 years for the 7th annual Kennedy Debate. Thanks again.